Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today. We are with Alina Anderson from Outreach.io, and she is going to give us a lot of insight today into sort of the trials and the work that they've gone through and the lessons that they've learned using developer portals, internal developer portals, to establish guidelines for production readiness of their applications. So Alina is a principal technical program manager at Outreach. Alina, maybe you could introduce yourself just a little bit, talk a little bit about like the role and what you're responsible for, and we'll get into kind of the meat of this presentation.
Awesome. Thanks, Justin. I'm excited to be here and talk about a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. I support our infrastructure, platform, and SRE teams, driving typically large cross-functional projects, programs, strategic programs. And the way I think about it is if I'm doing my job well, my infra and platform engineers have less stress, less burnout, less overwhelm. They just enjoy their coming into work a little bit more than they did yesterday. Oh, I think you're muted, Justin. There you go.
Gosh, look at me. So sorry about that. So before Outreach, you've had some kind of really interesting roles that have, sort of encompassed some of these like different skills and lessons that have brought you to here. But why do you think that how is kind of this particular experience sort of influence the type of technical program manager that you've sort of become? Talk a little bit about how that's unique. I think that role, technical program manager, can mean a lot of things, but at Outreach, I
Yeah,
think
it can.
it's really, really special. And I think because of that, it means that you have a very particular eye for this. Maybe talk a little bit about what's unique about your role, your role.
Yeah, TPM is a unique role, and it's a unique role at every organization, every team, and typically I think the common thread is you're bridging cross-functional work. It's a specific role you're deploying to solve cross-functional problems and challenges. And Mario Gerard, he's a TPM thought leader out there, and he does a really good job articulating the difference between depth, breadth, and SWAT team style of TPM work. And different situations call for different skills and approaches. I think I tend to be deployed in kind of a SWAT breadth manner, with whatever's on fire, which I think explains a lot of my gravitational pull towards DevOps and platform teams, is where we need immediate problem solving. And I think, to me, an effective TPM has a really big toolbox. So I've seen TPMs that have been business owners, have been product owners, have been engineers or QA. And I think knowing different areas of an organization, having different skills, really just makes you more effective. Because a lot of times you're solving novel problems. You got to be curious. You have to, whatever you're facing that day, you got to dig around in your toolbox and figure out, like, all right, what do we need today to get through this challenge? And I think we tend to underestimate the impact or influence that people challenges and people problems have. Sometimes it's very obvious, and sometimes it's a little bit more subtle on how we're actually developing our software, how we're actually designing our systems. And so sometimes when you have that role, you can step back and think about, okay, are we designing our systems based on our organizational dysfunction? Are we actually designing the best or right thing that we need for this moment? So that's kind of my 2 cents, is that an effective TPM can really be a value add and like a force multiplier within your team and organization. And I personally believe that every platform team and organization, every VP of platform absolutely needs a good TPM.
So that's super interesting. So I mean, you're dealing with technical challenges, but at the same time, you're dealing with cultural challenges as well.
Exactly.
I mean, I think that one thing that we've learned in this space is that you have to be intentional, and I think that means intentional in the culture that you're creating too.
Yeah.
So I think it's fair to say then that what kind of makes you unique to speak about this is that you've been able to navigate both of those things, that you've been able to see the technical ramifications and the human challenges of making the organization productive and to
Yeah.
work.
Yeah. And I think a lot of folks that are probably listening are dealing with some amount of migrations from one tool to another, or decomposing monolithic applications into microservices, or adoption of new observability practices. There's a set of things that um, yeah, you can have great technical solutions, but there's a certain amount of people-y things that can make it really challenging.
So that kind of is a pretty good segue, actually, talking about like the tool diversity and that sort of thing. So, like you've taken, we're talking about production readiness, and we're talking about
Yep.
using portals and data to establish baselines for production readiness. But tell me a little bit, like, what was the problem? I mean, I don't imagine that you just went out and said, "Oh, we need an IDP that's going to solve everything." Tell me a little bit about the problem that you experienced. Like, what led you to seek an IDP specifically for this problem? We talk a little bit about that experience of like choosing it. What was that like?
Yeah, I think we've had several iterations, which I think is expected and normal. This isn't the type of problem that you have a problem, you pick one tool, and then it's solved. This is like an ongoing space that you always have to be questioning what you're doing, why you're doing it, and the best ROI. Because I think early on, sometimes spreadsheets and things are sufficient. And then you reach a point where it no longer works. And that was the first journey that we had is, hey, what we're doing right now isn't working. We actually need to go look for a vendor to have a source of truth. You know, there was manual tracking going on, there was a lack of visibility. And as an organization grows, you've got lots of stakeholders that need to answer questions like, who owns this thing? For a variety of reasons, right? It might be cost related. It might be we need to upgrade a thing. We need whatever the driving thing is, you need to say, okay, who owns this? And without a source of truth for that, it's pretty painful. And people waste a lot of cycles trying to hunt things down, or some poor SRE is trying to like export stuff and has a spreadsheet that they're manually running around and asking people, do you own this? No, they left the company. I don't know who, like, I mean, everyone knows this. Um, and difficult to like to track progress when leadership's asking, okay, where are we at on this initiative? Do we have everything tagged? Yes or no? It's really hard to answer those questions. So we chose a tool and we went from zero source of truth to, hey, now we actually have a place, and the organization got in the habit of, hey, we have a source of truth. If I need to go here, figure it out. And then once we got further further along that journey and everyone started to get in the hang of, hey, you know what? Attribution for my stuff that I own is critical. And starting to set goals and KPIs around 100% of everything must be attributed to a team. Um, that's like the first piece, because once you have a team, then you can drive a lot of other things off of that. And so that was a lot of the focus of like the first leg of the journey.
So
Um,
service ownership, establishing service,
exactly.
and then even enforcing it, I think, to a
And it
degree.
sounds simple, but it's actually not that simple, because you get into all these different gray areas of ownership. And when it comes to like security vulnerabilities, okay, well, gray area doesn't work. You need you need an owner that needs to take action on that thing. And I think that's an example of where some SRE teams or platform teams can get overburdened and overstressed because they tend to be the default. Oh, well, if no owner, it automatically goes to this team and they'll fix it. They'll figure it out. And that just leads to frustration. And you have this kind of push and pull between like, okay, well, we need teams to take ownership of their stuff. Why are we compensating for them on these things? And so you go back and forth. So then once we went down that path for quite a while, we started with like one scorecard. And that one scorecard, you know, was pretty simple. And then it started to bloat, right? It started to kind of be like, okay, now we have this monolithic scorecard. Um, and we were hitting some limitations in some of the ways we wanted to be agile and dynamic in how we were handling production readiness requirements, et cetera. And that's what brought us to Cortex. And Cortex has really unlocked a lot of different capabilities for us to be operate in a way that allows teams to have ownership. We're more modular, we're more distributed versus having this kind of monolithic approach to production readiness.
So tell me a little bit like the pre-state. I mean, first of all, that's really interesting that you start with like, okay, we've got this problem with service ownership. Now we think we have a way to solve it. We're going to start using data to solve it. And then immediately that becomes this bloated and kind of not agile solution. And so it's like, all right, well, not necessarily back to the drawing board, but maybe just like a reframe or a different approach to how to consume this data. How do we make this data, like useful for us? Previous to kind of figuring that out, I mean, how many of these, like, I think we all are sort of familiar with like how a service can become orphaned. Maybe it never had an owner to begin with, or maybe that owner at that point left the company or something, and there was no contingency for that or no team. But like, if you could give me a ballpark, I mean, do you think like we're like half the services just floating around orphaned? Or was it like it was obviously significant enough to move the needle to try to solve the problem? What did that look like?
I don't think that things, I think sometimes there are explicit owners, implicit owners, there's assumed owners. And I think once you start getting that in black and white documented, it's very clear on, hey, when an alert or when this goes down, this is the on call that's going to be on the hook for that. And that sometimes will drive accountability discussions that really need to happen, because what can happen is you got an incident, support's like, hey, this thing's down, and then everyone's sort of like looking at each other like, uh who who owns that. Common scenario might be like a marketing website component that maybe you infra team set it up for the marketing team, and there's no on call for the marketing operations team, and then something goes down, and then support's like, hey, we're having an issue, customers are going to our homepage to log in, the website's down, who's on call for that? But so in a catalog, you're able to very explicitly say, hey, here's this domain or area, it's got to have an on-call owner. Let's have some conversations of who's going to provide on-call coverage for that component. Um, and then done. And then moving on to the next component that you got to flesh out.
Nice. And then it sounds, going back to that socio-technical problem, it's like these struts are going to help you be able to organize the data, but then there also needs to be something in place to say, okay, but when you establish a new service, it needs to go in the catalog and it needs to have the Slack channel or whatever it is, all of the means of which you're going to be able to contact the owners. So before we get more focused into what you're using for production readiness, I mean, I think it's really interesting that you kind of gone through this. You started with this ownership problem. Now you've unlocked, I think, a lot of stuff. Before we really focus on the production readiness aspects of the data and how you're using that, maybe just speak a little generally, what have emerged, do you think, as some of the most important, most prescriptive, and most actionable, I guess, metrics and data that you're getting around productivity and around developer experience sort
Yeah.
of in general out of this?
Yeah, there are a couple key areas that these don't change. It's just a matter of the how. The what never change, it's the how that's a continuous evolution of how we do this. And one is, how quickly can a developer go from zero to getting ramped up in shipping code? Because the business needs to know they've invested in an engineer, and the faster we can get them delivering business logic, delivering value, turning that into revenue, like, we're all winning. Um, and so once you actually start drilling into like, how do we measure that? What are the leading indicators? There's a lot in there, but that's the key thing that we're trying to look at. The next one would be, okay, how many times are code defects or configuration issues impacting our customers, and like, are we improving? Are we reducing the frequency and the severity by which code defects or configuration issues are hurting the customer experience? Are we getting better? Are we the same? Are we getting worse? The other axes that I think about is, are we improving the cost efficiency of our services? Same thing. The business needs to know, are we getting better, worse, the same? Or maybe we have to drive up the efficiency or not. And that gives you a bar to be able to see. Because if you're hitting that, like, yes, we're cost efficient as expected, great. Okay, now we can go spend time on other things. Just keep status quo there and go work on other areas that may need more attention. And then the fourth one that I think about is, are you meeting your security compliance baseline things to keep things like your SOC 2, your ISO, like the company being at risk for a SOC 2 or an ISO or other compliance frameworks that you might have is just not an option. There are certain baseline things that have to happen no matter what. And so then you kind of drill into, okay, how are you measuring this? How are we making sure that we can inspect our services and make sure we're good to go?
Super interesting. So it's like there's a range of metrics that are telling you a lot about kind of the overall organizational health of the product and also the teams. But a couple of these that you brought up, like, I would at least say they're like validation metrics for readiness, right? Like you talked about reducing code defects and you talked about meeting SOC 2 compliance and stuff like that. Those are things that ideally you have packaged, ready, accounted for, validated before pushing, and then you're able to look at
Exactly.
both sides of that, pre
Like, it
and post.
shouldn't be a surprise to you once you're like deploying to prod that these requirements or standards or things exist.
And then it's easy to say that, but then being able to actually enforce
Yep,
that
exactly. Yeah, the
is
how is where things can
right.
get tricky.
So then let's talk about that. I mean, let's baseline it first. So I have a feeling that there's not going to be like, a simple black and white answer to this, because we know that in cultures of
Yeah.
continuous improvement, we don't even use the word done, right? It's never done, right? But maybe from like a per release perspective, just tell us a little bit of it. Like, when do things feel done to you? Like when it's like, all right, I think we've done everything we can do. I think we've done the diligence according to our new tooling and our new practices and stuff. What does that look like to you?
So I think a key thing here is the minimum bar of alignment. So when we talk about an IDP, consistent standards across the organization, it isn't, Joe's opinion, Susie's opinion of done, Larry's opinion of done. Like, there is one minimum bar of, hey, we've all agreed that in order to deploy to production, it needs to meet X, Y, and Z. And so the challenge is that, based on the unique situations that can happen, we've all been there, where it's like, okay, we got to ship this feature. We've got a deadline. Here's the 75-point checklist that we have to, and now we have like, well, we'll get an exception for this, exception for this, exception for that, because we have to deliver it. And so I think one piece here is that I think about is, because that can be a frustrating feeling for people that feel like, well, we did all this work to define definition of done, and now we're just kind of throwing half the checklist away just because there's a deadline. So you have to bake in, that is actually a natural part of this whole ecosystem. Production readiness, assume there's going to be exceptions. Assume there's going to be a decision that balances risk, velocity, risk to the business, risk to systems, risk. And so there's almost, as part of your production readiness, there's a risk assessment, because you may make some adjustments. And I think the key there is making sure folks understand that a risk assessment is being conducted, what risks were maybe evaluated and kind of just documenting, hey, yeah, we know typically we do these things. Here's the risk assessment that we did, and the determination or the decision was to do this, and we're going to mitigate the risk in these ways. And that's where a tool like Cortex that has all the exception stuff built into the product makes it super duper easy to do that, because then you can potentially require and have a process around, hey, we understand that exceptions happen. We understand that even though we really, really, really want this, we've conducted our due diligence, gone through this process of risk assessment, and now we're documenting that, hey, instead of meeting this requirement the day of release, we're giving a 1 week exception, and they're going to do this follow-on work, and it will be due, you know, the exception will expire like in a week or whatever. I think the other thing, going back here to defining done, a lot of third-party vendors, including Cortex, including a lot of the other ones everyone is familiar with, are coming up with their own version of production readiness, of definition of done, of best practices, of templates, and it's a lot. It's a lot to internalize and to ingest, and so every organization, it's like a melting pot of external sources and opinions, internal opinions, because maybe you have AWS's way of doing it, you have Microsoft's way of doing it, you have Google's way of doing it, and you have other companies' ways of doing it. And so you're trying to somehow reconcile that all together within your organization to, okay, what is this minimum bar of alignment? And it's challenging. And so I think that's where I come back to, there is no one perfect definition. Like, you have to think of this as a living, breathing definition that's continually iterating. And like, if you have something that's a requirement, but it gets an exception 90% of the time, then guess what? Like, you should remove that.
So okay. So by using a portal by using Cortex, right, you're able to keep track of, I guess, sort of the progress of some of these, and like, okay, we're close to where we should be able to meet the SLOs, or where we should pretty much know that when we push this thing out, we're not going to cause, major problems. But you keep using this like minimum bar of alignment. Like, I really kind of love this term, because it's like, all right, we get the stakeholders, we get all the people who are going to, like, who's really going to be impacted if we really
Yep.
like get this wrong, right? And we
Yep.
give them a single place and a single framework to all agree upon, which to me,
Yep.
that's like that cultural fragmentation. It seems like that's something that you're actually using the portal to directly
Yeah.
address. Is that fair?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think sometimes it requires poking a little bit on assumptions and status quo, because sometimes it can feel as a human very comforting to put some requirement in there that makes us feel like we have a standard for something, but in practice, it's something that actually creates kind of friction and headaches and isn't actually delivering or having the outcome that we believe it is having. And so I think we have to be very mindful of, because no engineer wants to fill out a TPS report of all these things just to ship something. And so I think you need to be very ruthless in, okay, what is this requirement? What are we actually preventing? Is this just making us feel better about ourselves, or are we actually improving our service, our systems and infrastructure by having this check?
So we're gonna dive the little tease here. We're gonna work on a piece of content that's a little bit, I guess, more rich than the discussion. So we'll talk more about some of these like specific metrics, and we'll look at some of the like the actual screens and stuff that stakeholders are using to action some of these things at outreach. But maybe you could tell us a little bit about right now. Like, we've gotten kind of high level about, okay, we need to get these different stakeholders involved. But when we actually talk, just get to the ground about like what are some of these things that we're enforcing? Like,
Yeah,
for instance, you mentioned AWS tagging. Like, this is the level of detail that we're really tracking, right? Talking about
yeah,
readiness.
exactly. And
Yeah.
so there's a couple examples I want to talk about today that serve as what I would consider like the minimum bar of alignment. One is a security standard scorecard.
Hmm.
So the security standard scorecard is owned by our security organization, and they, through collaboration and partnership, um, there is an agreed upon set of checks that we have meets security standard, below security standard. And so your service either meets the standard or it's below the standard. And the expectation is that you're meeting the standard. So it's like very simple to understand. This is the standard. These are the things I need to do to meet the standard. And the security team owns and drives the development, inception of potentially expanding, adding new standards to that standard, and then links out to documentation and yada yada. Um, so that's one. And then we have an AWS tagging standard. So the key thing about this is that the tagging is the most critical piece for attribution, because as soon as that RDS database or S3 bucket or whatever else you've got going on there is tagged, then boom, you've got it to the right team, you've got an owner, and now all of the horizontal initiatives you may be driving across your services, cost, capacity, incidents, whatever the initiative is, it now is attributed to the right team. So we're all in alignment that the bar is 100%, everything must be 100% attributed. So you cannot have resources in production unless it has an owner. And that's been a journey, right? Like it's been a journey because you have to go, uh, once you start that process, you have to deal with legacy untag stuff once you introduce enforcement. And now we're at a place now where we no longer have any legacy to clean up and we have enforcement on. So it's like if your stuff's not tagged, you're out of luck. And it's great. And it no longer are people having to export spreadsheets, go run around and track things down. It's very simple. Like you create a S3 bucket, it needs an owner. If you don't have an owner, bye bye.
How do you think that, I mean, as you start like really fleshing out these details, like you're talking about, that was just one set of standards. That's just
Yeah.
security standards. And that alone is like, oh my gosh, trying to manage that across multiple departments. But then you also had mentioned like just the things down to the nitty gritty of like making sure that all the tags are correct and the infrastructure that we're pushing out to cloud, or making sure that we're using all the correct minimum required versions. I mean, there's all this kind of stuff. And now it's like, it kind of begs the question, like, how are teams even managing this without a
Yeah.
solution like the
Yeah,
portal?
no, and that's where uh I see, platform SRE managers, directors, engineers um doing their best, spinning up Google Sheets, spinning up um different types of tracking, like they export it and then you're trying to then navigate um all these different things, and it's really challenging. And so you end up as a team, so like as a application team where you're a manager and you have all these things coming at you from a million different directions, you just can't keep track of what security is expecting from you, what SRE is expecting from you, what like all these different things. And then whether it was in some Slack channel, you don't remember which one they announced that you're supposed to take an action. It's very common where it's like, hey, we did this data dump, we did this thing, we need you to go in and update this spreadsheet, and then you post it in the channel and call to action, everybody go do this thing. But once you add that up, the natural and expected behavior for a team is going to be like, well, crap, I guess I'll just wait till somebody yells at me because I can't actually track all of this. It's just not possible.
So that kind of comes back to that intentionality again, because you're right. The leak's gonna go somewhere. Someone's gonna fix it eventually, right? And someone is gonna find a throat to choke somewhere. But to be able to have that stuff established, published, visible, and
Yeah,
able to
and it's
collaborate
moving
on.
it to proactive, right? Because it's like, okay, if I'm a manager, I can log in the morning and be like, okay, let me just take a quick pass and see where all my stuff is at, and is there anything actionable here that I need to take care of? It's like the push versus pull. And so the more you can move towards self-service, and that manager who's in a super proactive mood that morning and has an extra 30 minutes can just go log in, create a couple Jira ticks for their team, and then boom, like you're on your way. Um, Otherwise, the default behavior is just reactive and waiting until someone hunts them down to do something.
So then, not to make to make the conversation even more complicated, but then, if we've got these two things where it's like we just described a snapshot of all the checks that need to happen and all the different areas that need to be agreed upon for like one release, but we're also working in a culture of continuous improvement where even
Mhm.
these definitions of doneness, like I think we're converging on this as just as a moving target, right? That's like fair to say.
Yeah, I think I would describe it as a living a living document. I would describe it as dynamic, that the way the way you iterate on production readiness is not as a static checklist, because it it's really, really hard to keep up to date. It's really, really hard to enforce use of checklists. It's super manual, and the and the requirements are always changing. So some of the examples, let's say you had the 3-month working group and you came up with like the most perfect checklist known to man, and it's amazing and everybody's so excited. And then 2 weeks later, there's a new engineering leader that maybe wants to add or change some items on it, or there's a new product requirement, or there's a new capability that has been deployed, or even support. Maybe support has, hey, through these incidents, we learned we had these gaps and they need to be added as requirements, or even just something as, hey, crawl, walk, run, our organization could handle maybe at that time of the working group 5 requirements. And now we're just killing it. We're doing so good. 3 months later, we want to add 10 more requirements. So I think that production readiness is a living document, is constantly going to be iterated on. And so it's about having, how do we maintain consistency and know that it's going to be evolving. And there's all different strategies. A lot of it depends on your organization, and a lot of it depends on sometimes like pushing back on leadership. Do we really need to be that agile? Maybe we could time box any changes to requirements to monthly or quarterly, and versus, you know, it must change right now and now everybody has to scramble around to meet this new requirement. It's very, you know, so you know the best in your organization what approach, but sometimes it's just asking the question, or even if you just have the process, hey, this is how we intake new requirements for production readiness, and we evaluate these, the working group evaluates these on a monthly basis. Um, and then we give teams a 30-day heads up. Hey, guess what? We have this new scorecard in Cortex that's upcoming requirements that has a due date, and maybe you have an initiative on it that creates Jira tickets or whatever. And so then they feel informed, involved. They have a little bit of a chance to kind of meet that, because what can happen is folks who didn't were not necessarily paying attention to the one Slack post and the one channel on the one day, they go to just do their job and deploy something and they get blocked. And they're like, what the heck? And it's like, oh, there's this new requirement. I didn't know about this new requirement. And now I have to stop and it's frustrating and it's super annoying. Um, so that's where coming back to um, the, you know, having the self-service, being able to log in, um, and check prod readiness as like living as close to the code as possible, not a static checklist that was filled out, is not up to date. Um, and everyone hates doing.
So by establishing that, yeah, you have all of these new points of friction, right? Because they're potential quality gates and things that developers will have to deal with in order to just sort of do their job. So by doing this, we introduce all of these different points of friction. But as we know, a portal, Cortex, a system of record that we can all use to collaborate on and that we can self-service is a great way to deal with all of that sort of inevitable
Yeah,
friction.
exactly. And like one example is sometimes you roll out a new check because you think it's a genius idea, and then you realize based on feedback, oh, whoops, like we need to roll that back because it caused maybe more friction, or we weren't as aligned as we thought, or whatever. And that's going to happen. You can't prevent that 100%, but like at least having the mechanism by which you can very easily just be like, okay, cool. Um, we'll just pull that back into draft mode or whatever you need to do.
The you mentioned before talking about like some of these standards that you established, like you mentioned before that you're kind of binary about it, that you got like meet standard or below standard. Was that how did you kind of, I mean, this is going to, vary, I think, depending on products and like whether people have varying SLOs for customers or products and
Yeah.
things like that.
hmm
But in your case, in the case of outreach, how did you come to that decision?
So I think there are, like you said, there's an infinite amount of use cases for things that may prevent you from deploying to production. It's binary. Either you meet the standard or you don't. And it's much easier to understand. It's much easier to get alignment on, is this a blocking requirement or not? And because what we found in previous iterations and previous tools of having this very beautiful, complicated, um, lots of aspirational levels, for the most part, people do work to what's required. And yeah, you do have some aspirational stuff here and there, but like a lot of it was just to make ourselves feel better about this aspirational like world. And yeah, you could in Cortex you can have like a specific, hey, here's the aspirational gold star A plus um, scorecard that you can do. But I think, at least from my perspective in our current organizations, where a lot of companies have had layoffs, a lot of teams are owning way more than maybe they've owned in the past, where you're stretched so thin that really your goal is to get to what's required. Um, and the justification to do more than what's required is like not that solid.
So then, and then these folks that are like responsible for deciding on what's required. I mean, you've already sort of hinted at like, look, there's a lot of them, right? It's sort of a
hmm
broad group of people, but because we've got this nice system of record, we can help to collaborate. Who are some of the like talk a little bit about the people who contribute to the standards and who are the stakeholders
Yeah.
for it? Do they all interact with the portal in some way, even through an integration like Slack, or how
hmm
does that look like on the ground?
Yeah, I think there's a couple paradigms here to think about, which are going to look different for every organization. You have kind of like an ivory tower model versus like more of an open source model for some of these like standards or requirements. Um, and you have centralized versus distributed, you know, having a lot of complexity is harder to manage, but having clear owners, like security standard, security is responsible for that standard. And they can then manage that through Terraform. They can have, and people could potentially comment, collaborate directly in source control on that standard. Um, and that goes for so every scorecard has an owner, and they're responsible for sort of driving the requirements. So like for dev tooling as an example that has some minimum required versions for some of our modules and other things that you need to be on, they're ensuring that, hey, we have set the minimum required versions for these and everyone needs to be on these required versions um, before they can deploy to production. So, so I think the key part is figuring out if the pressure point is going to be on any standard you have that, let's say, is preventing a deployment, because any standard you have or requirement you have that's I am now blocked is going to have more pressure than if it's more informational, or what's the bad thing that happens if I'm not meeting the standard. And so I think if you are going to have anything that's in the development workflow and deployment pipeline, like you need to be very clear of like, okay, if they're blocked, what's the quickest way for them to get this resolved? And that's through clear error documentation. So when it fails, how do they fix it? Exactly what they need to do to go fix it. Because if they just get a generic error in Cortex and then they're like, okay, and then they got to flounder around in Slack to try to figure out how to fix it, it's not a good experience. And so putting in there, hey, if you see this error on this check, you're missing this thing, go update this configuration here, and, try again.
So that's super. So you can do these things then. You can set these standards, you can create these quality gates, but you can do so in a way that doesn't fully impede the developer workflow, that doesn't pull them out of their flow state to a degree, or at least less often. Because I
Yeah.
mean, we all know that there's a million
Yep.
interruptions, and if we can just save a
Totally.
few throughout the day, we
And you
save a.
can even put exception guidance in there, right? Of like,
Mm,
hey, you failed this check because you're missing XYZ. If this is your circumstance, you can submit an exception request for this, and this, and like providing that back to them right there, then they know like, oh, cool. Okay, I meet the criteria to submit exception. I'm gonna go ahead and submit that right now. Sending people out to external documentation is always harder. Handling it there, I found, is more successful.
It's really, really interesting to just kind of hear how like just how that kind of works in reality. So we're coming kind of towards the close. I mean, let's talk a little bit about the process. So we find the problem, we find the right portal, we decide this is going to solve the problem. We're landing on Cortex. It's great. Cortex is everything that we need to solve some of these issues. Tell us a little bit about that early kind of onboarding phase. What was it like integrating the systems,
Yeah,
and maybe a little bit of a future roadmap. Where are you kind
yeah.
of heading next?
Yeah, I work with a lot of third-party tools, and it's very rare that I say onboarding was enjoyable or fun. And it's usually a pain. Anyone that's done, setting up new tools and all that is pretty challenging. And I think being able to integrate with your tools, so PagerDuty and Datadog and AWS and all of these different systems, was incredibly easy. And the data started flowing in, and we were able to start working with it. So that was definitely a fun part of the setup. I think I think I was pretty opinionated on how we were thinking about designing the catalog, but I think if you're starting clean and fresh and you're just in there, definitely spend some time diagramming out, penciling out what you think your structure is going to be across domains and services and resources and teams, before you get in there and start creating stuff. It's helpful to just kind of the relationship to how those things flow with scorecards, and doing a little bit of that diagramming. I think you guys have posted some of that content out there, but um, and how scorecards might relate to each other, because I think spending a little bit of time about is helpful there. As an example, if you're in your deployment pipeline and you're like, hey, when you deploy, go check the score for this service on this scorecard, this scorecard, this scorecard, this scorecard, thinking through what that flow is going to look like. Are you going to just have one big long scorecard and you just check one thing? Are you going to have multiple things? Thinking through that will help you quite a bit. And then I think spending a little bit of time focusing on groups, like for scorecards, you can do a lot of fancy filtering and exclusions, and I think it's easy to overcomplicate it. And then even you forget like what all your complex filtering rules are. Um, so even though it's a very easy platform, I think spending some time to really diagram out what your information architecture and relationships are going to be between the different objects is helpful.
That's really good advice. I mean, it just seems like it's such an overwhelming problem. I could see even with a straightforward tool, it's like, okay, where do I begin? But being able to draw that out. So, and then how have the developers taken? I mean, let's talk a little about that. I mean, subjectively, how have the developers sort of seen this change? Have you noticed new effects, behaviors, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I think because the paradigm we shifted from sort of a very fancy spread list of things. So that was kind of our paradigm in the previous tool was just a very fancy list. And now I've heard multiple comments of people when they log in, like, oh, wow, like I didn't know I could see this and I could see this and I could see this as going to one service page. It's like now I can see my security vulnerabilities. I can see my deployments. I can see my SLOs. I can see all my metadata. Like there's all this rich information. Um, and the most common question is like, who's on call for what? And now it's super easy. Um, the Slack bot has been a hit. Some of the reminders that go directly to Teams has been a hit. Um, and yeah, and so I think now we're we're gonna be embarking on like the next phase of like, okay, now that we're all familiar, comfortable, what's sort of the next level of driving that next level down of inspection on your systems. And that gets into quite a few of like potentially GitHub metrics. We're
Mm,
looking at some of those pieces. Um, there's a lot of manual things that people are putting in like their service YAMLs and in their service repositories. And we're looking at ways of automating that so you can just literally log in, look at your service and say, okay, across all these shared components that that are owned by different teams, am I up on all the latest versions across all these things? Um, so yeah, it's been super fun and it is challenging and there's a bunch of stuff we haven't even embarked on, like plugins, actions, um, and so I'm sure there's a whole uh, field of things there that we could leverage.
we'll have to do a follow up and kind of see some of that progress. So no, but that's I mean I love hearing fun because you're right. I mean, who wants to go through that? But I could actually see that like viscerally when you start to connect these systems and you start to I could see that being very satisfying. Just sort of yeah, paint
Totally.
a picture of all this stuff that was sort of nebulous before. So you've given us so much good advice and thank you. Any other kind of general pointers about a team specifically that says we want to now take on intentionally, culturally a production readiness initiative? What maybe just a couple
Yeah,
of just
I
thoughts?
think I think
Yeah.
the first thing that I think of is whether you realize it or not today, you do have there is a concept of production readiness, even if it's just um, tribal knowledge. And so it's like starting to capture like, okay, today, what are all the things that people have to check before they can deploy? And maybe it's like, oh, they have to have a meeting with this one person. Oh, they have to go do this thing. Oh, they have to go do this thing. And you can start to kind of build, like, make visible what your organization is already doing. And so it's like, okay, they have to meet with Bob before they deploy. Okay, great. What questions is Bob asking? And how do we start to programmatically capture these things in a way that is no longer dependent upon, meeting with the one guru? There's a lot of things we all know, it's like observability stuff, QA stuff, code quality stuff, security stuff, feature stuff, support enablement stuff. It's a common set of things that even just surfacing, hey guys, did you know that in order to deploy something, they have to have 3 weeks of meetings to have all these conversations? What if we consolidated this, or look, here they have to do a manual attestation on this spreadsheet that they pinky promised that they did this thing. What if we just checked for this variable, or what if we just set a new variable, true, false, or something, and then we just check that automatically and they no longer have to do the spreadsheet?
Very interesting. And then, so it sounds, and I mean, I realize I should have reframed this last question based on our discussion now, because I don't think that we're going to end up with actually a technical answer. But I think that's a good thing. I think that what we've learned here is that yeah, there are just as many, if not more, human problems that we can deal with by using this portal and data driven visibility approach. So let me ask you then, what is the first thing that any team listening today could do right at this moment, even without an IDP, to set down this path that's been successful for you and for your organization?
I think it would be creating like a Google Doc of who owns this, and then just document in our organization, how do we answer the question, who owns this? And you might be surprised at what that journey that takes you on. How do we answer this question, who owns this?
Amazing.
Um,
So just start really asking those probing questions of ownership, because I think from what you told us, where you may not necessarily like the answers that you start uncovering. So,
yeah, and Cameron, looks like Cameron dropped a question. Yeah, formalizing a production readiness initiative. I think so. In my opinion, whoever asked that question or is asking that question is trying to solve a specific pain point. And it might be like, man, we've been shipping way too many freaking bugs and we need everyone to like QA their stuff before they ship it. Or it might be we've had way too many incidents and we don't have consistency in X, Y, and Z. And so because production readiness is such a broad thing, what you can do is just set a roadmap of like, okay, production readiness initiative in Q1, we're specifically going to focus on whatever that one pain point is. And then you can kind of articulate, okay, in Q2, then there's like the next piece that we're going to then incorporate. Because what I've seen is if you start with the whole thing, it just becomes this very overwhelming list, and that's so coming back to, okay, within your org, what is the pain point with production readiness? Is it just because we need a TPS report to feel better? Or is it that there's actually a felt impact to customers that we're trying to correct?
I think that intentionality is really like a key theme here, and part of why it's been so successful. So we'll give just a moment. I see one new question. Oh, there's a couple of questions around logistics. I think Cameron can help with that. I do see, are there general rules that should be applicable? Oh, that's a great question. Are there some
Yeah,
general rules that should be applicable
I
to
think
every organization's
I
production?
think yes. When you deploy new code, it should not break customers in any way, right? So support is usually a great um, uh, gold mine of information. Just talking with them, hey, so in your experience, how are we breaking customers? And that could be new feature releases, that could be incidents, that could be bugs. Like support has the whole surface area of the different ways in which engineering changes, engineering work um, is breaking customers in a way that we're not intending to. Um, so that's one. The other one is everything that we ship should not put our security and compliance certifications or um, product security at risk.
So it's quality, it's security, right? These are concerns that everyone should have, and that's interesting. These cross-functional things, I feel like could be a subject on its own. I would love to just sit down and talk through more of that success engineering feedback pipeline, and how we can think beyond just dealing with bugs and stuff. But unfortunately, I think we're we're out of time and we're on
I
our
love
last
this topic. Thank you for
question.
giving me the opportunity to talk about it.
Alina, thank you for taking the time. I really think that this was so informative, and I can't wait to do a follow-up. And as I mentioned, we may come up with some good long-form content here too. So thanks everybody for the time and for the questions. Thanks, Alina, so much for the expert advice and for the perspective. I think we all really learned a lot, and I can't wait to keep pulling on this thread.